All right, let's be seated. General, go ahead and call your witness. I think you did before, and that's when I decided it's time for a break. But
State calls Dr. Marco Ross.
You raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated.
You ready? You are Dr. Marco Ross?
Yes.
Okay, and what kind of doctor are you, sir?
I'm a forensic pathologist and the chief medical examiner at the West Tennessee Regional Forensic Center.
Okay, and tell the jury, if you don't mind, what is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is the study of those diseases and conditions that result in injury and death.
Okay. Is there a difference between a medical examiner and a forensic pathologist?
Well, a forensic pathologist has specific training to perform examinations on bodies to assess the causes of death. A medical examiner is often a forensic pathologist, but sometimes can also be another type of physician who acts more administratively in ascertaining and directing investigations into causes and manners of death.
So fair to say you are both?
Yes.
Okay. Does the medical examiner's office where you work, do they investigate all deaths in your area?
We are responsible for in examining those deaths that occur either due to undetermined means or are unattended deaths or unnatural deaths.
Okay, and how is a death investigation initiated?
We are contacted typically by law enforcement, sometimes hospital, but usually a law enforcement agency will contact us informing us of the death of an individual and describe the circumstances to us, and we'll determine whether or not it's a case that falls within medical examiner jurisdiction.
Okay, and what does the death investigation entail?
From our standpoint, our investigators will collect information about the circumstances of death for the office that I'm in. If the death occurs in Shelby County in a non-hospital location, our investigator will usually go to that scene and do an initial investigation and examination of the body at the scene. Subsequently, we will arrange to have the body transported to our facility for subsequent examination.
Okay, are you aware of what happens in the more rural counties of West Tennessee?
They have their own individual county medical examiners who are, when notified of a death, if they determine that an autopsy is needed, will make arrangements to have that autopsy sent to one of the forensic centers in the state with an order for an autopsy.
Okay, and before performing an autopsy, are you interested in learning of the decedent's activities prior to death?
That is sometimes helpful to know in trying to ascertain a cause and manner of death.
Okay, and would you tell the jury, what does an autopsy consist of?
An autopsy is an examination of the body that involves both an external examination and an internal examination. We examine first the outer surfaces of the body, looking for evidence of disease and injury, and then we examine the internal parts of the body, making incisions in the chest, abdomen, and head in order to examine the internal organs and structures of the body, again looking for evidence of disease and injury.
Do you also perform or have toxicology performed?
We collect samples for toxicology and have those samples sent to an outside laboratory for analysis.
Is it routine for forensic pathologists to have outside labs perform toxicology?
That's a pretty standard procedure. Only the largest urban medical examiner offices tend to have their own in-house toxicology laboratories. Most agencies, most medical examiner offices around the country send theirs to an outside toxicology laboratory.
Okay, and what is the ultimate aim when you're conducting a death investigation?
To determine a cause of death and a manner of death.
Okay. just briefly, or no, it's not going to be briefly. It's not going to be briefly. I'm sorry, but can you give us a rundown of your education and your professional experience?
Yes, I received my medical degree from Tulane University in 1985, then completed a residency in general surgery at the University of South Carolina in 1991. After that, I served as a general surgeon in the U.S. Navy from 91 to 95, then completed a residency in anatomic and clinical pathology at the University of Vermont in 1999, and then completed a fellowship in forensic pathology at the University of North Carolina in 2000. Following that, I served as a medical examiner in Phoenix, Arizona for approximately 2.5 years, and then Spokane, Washington for about 4.5 years before coming to Memphis, where I have served as a forensic pathologist medical examiner since March of 2007.
And can you estimate the number of death investigations you have been a part of?
Well, just numbers of autopsies alone, I'm on the order of about 5,000 autopsies. There are some additional investigations on top of that for which we did not perform autopsies, but still did some element of an examination.
Okay, and have you testified in court before to your conclusions in these autopsies and death investigations?
Yes.
Okay, do you know how many times?
I'd say at least 100 times, if not more.
Okay, and those 100 times you've testified, were you declared an expert in forensic pathology?
Yes.
Would you like to board the witness?
Mr. Taylor, would you like to examine Dr. Ross as to his qualifications?
Judge, I have experience with Dr. Ross, so I do not wish to board either.
State tenders Dr. Ross as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
Court accepts Dr. Ross as an expert in the field of forensic pathologist and medical examination.
Dr. Ross, are you familiar with the investigation into the death of Karen Swift?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and how did you come to be involved?
I was asked to review the case. This case was, and the autopsy examination was performed by Dr. Karen Chancellor, who was then the chief medical examiner at the West Tennessee Regional Forensic Center. She since expired, and I took over first as acting chief, then became the chief medical examiner, and was responsible for reviewing cases that she had done in the past.
Okay, and what did you do to assume responsibility for the case?
In order to do that, I basically looked over the record, the file that we have, the autopsy report that she completed, and reviewed the photographs that were taken at the time of the autopsy.
Okay, and after reviewing the data and the photographs collected, did you come to your own independent conclusions as to the causes of death in this case?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and can you summarize for the jury, let's start in with the autopsy, you summarize for the jury the external description of Karen Swift's body when it arrived at the medical examiner's office?
The external examination showed that this was a severely decomposed body with partial skeletonization, meaning that already a lot of the soft tissue had decomposed away from the skeletal structures, and bony tissue and bone and parts of the skeleton were exposed. The areas of bony skeleton that were exposed included portions of the head and the face, the neck, the upper back, the pelvic area, and parts of some of the extremities, the arms and legs.
Okay. What about the thyroid bone, the hyoid bone and the thyroid cartilage? Were they identified?
No, they were not.
Okay. And when you have a missing hyoid, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble pronouncing that, and thyroid cartilage missing, can strangulation be ruled out as a cause of death?
No, it cannot be.
Okay. Was there evidence of injury, other evidence of injury to the body?
Yes, there was. There was a very severe, complex skull fracture on the right side of the head. It was somewhat depressed and extended into most of the portions of the skull on the right side of the head. In addition, part of that fracture line extended across the top of the head over onto the left side of the head.
I'm asking the bailiff to hand you some photographs.
And these were photographs taken not exactly at the time of autopsy, but sometime after the initial autopsy was performed. The portions of the skull were further cleaned and examined in order to look at the fractures a little bit more completely on the skull.
Would you describe those as left, right, and top views of the skull?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And would you make them exhibit to your testimony?
Yes.
Ask them to be state's next exhibit and published to the jury.
Any objection, Mr. Taylor?
No, Your Honor.
All right. It's number 17, I think, Helen. What's your plan at this time in terms of publishing to the
Well,
jury?
I would like to post them to the jury so they can see them before the rest of the examination of Dr. Ross.
Okay. We'll pause and let them review them for a moment.
Well, now I guess I'm getting back to Dr. Ross in case he wants to refer to them. Dr. Ross, in a case like this where the decomposition is so severe, how is the identity of the person being autopsied established?
In this case, identification was established by an odontologic examination of the teeth and the dental restorations, and using ante-mortem radiographs or dental imaging and dental records. Our odontologist, Dr. Turner, made that identification.
And it was confirmed to be Karen Swift?
Yes.
Okay. Let's get back to the wound that the jury just saw the pictures of. Would this wound be fatal in your opinion?
Yes, it would be.
Okay. Would it render a person immediately unconscious?
Yes, it would.
Okay. How quickly would you expect this wound to cause death?
Well, it could have occurred almost instantaneously if the impact was directed into areas of the brain that affected respiration and heart rate. The brain, of course, being a very complex structure with a lot of different nervous pathways, when you have an injury over this large an area, the forces that get directed into the brain from that injury can affect different areas of the brain. Depending on what areas of the brain it can affect, it will determine how quickly an individual would die. At the very least, again, if the significant forces were directed to very critical areas of the brain, death could have occurred almost instantaneously. On the other hand, if some of those areas were missed, but other areas were affected at the most because of the degree of hemorrhage that likely would have occurred, because you have this what's called a depressed fracture in there. So you would have laceration of a lot of blood vessels on the surface of the brain and in the lining of the skull, and that would have caused extensive hemorrhage into the brain, but it may have taken anywhere from several minutes to upwards of possibly even a few hours for enough bleeding to have occurred into the brain to have caused death. So this is a little bit of a range of how quickly death may have occurred.
And can you tell which of those occurred in this case?
No, I cannot.
Okay. And from your examination, can you tell whether this wound was an open wound or a closed wound?
No, I cannot.
Okay. And would you describe the difference between open and closed to the jury?
With any type of fracturing, you can have it described as an open or a closed type of wound. An open fracture involves, when there's a fracture to a structure, there's often a defect in the overlying skin. It's a large, like a laceration or a tear, an opening that has communication between the surface of the skin and the injured structure. On the other possibility of those, it could have been closed. So it's sort of like, you break a bone in your arm, but you have no outer break in the skin. You just get like basically bruising, and that's considered a closed fracture. Well, a closed, fracture or head injury like that would be the same thing, where the scalp and the skin surface could still be intact, but you could still have that degree of injury to the skull.
And how much bleeding would you expect from a closed wound?
From a closed wound, if the skin was entirely intact, there'd be minimal bleeding.
Okay.
Externally, there would be a lot of bleeding internally, but externally, minimal bleeding.
Okay. And given the state of decomposition, is it possible to determine if this injury occurred before or after death?
That cannot be determined in this case.
Okay. If that injury occurred after death, would that affect the amount of blood? If it were an open wound, would that affect the amount of blood that the wound produced?
Yes, it could. And
describe why that is to the jury, please.
If this injury occurred, before, basically, essentially at the time of death, and the heart is still beating and it's an open wound, then you have still blood flow, and it's the active blood flow into the head and through the open wound, which is why you may get more bleeding. Whereas if you're deceased when that happens, then there's no longer a blood flow occurring in the head because the heart has stopped beating. There may still be some blood that's going to come out anyway, but not as much as you would expect to see if the person was still alive and the heart was beating and that blood was being more vigorously coming out of the wound.
In the report, in the part of the report that talks about the X-rays, I see there is a note about an irregularity of the second right rib And I think
Yes.
it describes it as a remote fracture. Can you explain what the term remote fracture means?
That means remote in time. There was an irregularity on the rib surface, and to my eye, it possibly could have been an old fracture. It could be also due to some other type of lesion on the rib. If it was a fracture, it was a very well-healed one that would have occurred, months, if not years, prior to the time of death.
Okay, so fair statement, that rib, whatever the irregularity was in the rib, wasn't involved in her death.
Correct.
Okay. Was toxicology performed in this case?
Yes.
Okay. Were there any substances of note found in Karen Swift's system?
Toxicology analysis of the liver tissue revealed the presence of ethanol, alcohol, acetaminophen, also known as Tylenol, caffeine, and diphenhydramine, also known as Benadryl.
Okay. And I see also in the lab report that it cautions patients taking diphenhydramine from operating heavy machinery. Do you know why that is?
Because diphenhydramine has sedating side effects. As a matter of fact, it's frequently used as an over-the-counter sleep aid.
Okay. And does taking diphenhydramine, does a person taking diphenhydramine who's already been consuming alcoholic beverages, does that present any additional issues for that person?
Yes, there is a risk that you're combining the sedating effects of alcohol and diphenhydramine.
Okay. Was there any evidence collected from the body for further analysis by outside individuals?
The evidence collected included the clothing, which was just some underpants that were found, some hair from the scalp, some fibers that were found on the hands, and fingernail clippings from the right and left hands.
Okay. Now, I'm pretty sure I understand why underpants and nail clippings were collected. Can you tell us why the scalp hair was collected?
A lot of that is partly due to the pre-DNA era. Hair was frequently a type of evidentiary biologic material that could be used to connect an individual with a set of circumstances or another individual or a scene. And then because although each person doesn't have their own unique hair, there are a lot of different hair types and hair colors, and when you even look at hair microscopically, it has different textures, so it varies a lot. And so there are many different hair types, and you can sort of use that sometimes to say that this hair is consistent. If you found the hair from a deceased individual in a certain location, you could say, well, it's consistent with that. And even now, they can actually use the DNA on the hair to do it. Of course, we usually almost always go just with DNA from another source, but the hair from DNA can be used.
Okay. Was an internal examination performed?
Yes.
Okay. Did that internal examination yield any information for you?
Only in that, again, it substantiated the degree of decomposition. For example, in the head, although there was that fracture that was present, there was like minimal brain tissue present. I think they described basically about 300 grams of semi-liquid tissue in the brain, considering that the brain normally weighs about anywhere from 1,100 to 1,400 grams. That's about a quarter of the amount of brain tissue that was left in the brain, and it had already degraded to a point that was really identifiable only as brain tissue, and nothing more could be said about it. Some of the other organs were a little bit more intact, although still decomposed. You could look at the heart was present and did not show any significant disease on the heart. The lungs were present, showed no obvious abnormalities in the lungs, no foreign materials. The liver was again decomposed, but no obvious defects or injuries on the liver. And the spleen was still intact, as were the pancreas and some of the intestines. However, some of the neck structures were missing, particularly the tracheal cartilage, or the laryngeal cartilage, part of the larynx, and the hyoid bone, which is a bone that is at the base of the tongue and sort of helps to connect the tongue to the larynx. That was missing. Also missing was a lot of the organs from the pelvis.
Okay, and was that described in the report as internal genitalia not being identified?
Correct.
And were you able to determine why they were not identified?
The findings are consistent with decomposition being the reason for those organs being missing, unless, of course, she had a previous hysterectomy. That may also account for it.
Okay. Let's go back to the internal examination of the neck. You stated that Dr. Chancellor found in the internal examination that the cervical vertebral bodies demonstrate mild degenerative changes, but no evidence of injury. If someone had been strangled to death, would you expect to find injury to the neck?
With strangulation, when you have injury to the neck, it's typically some hemorrhage in the tissues on the front of the neck, and quite frequently you can also cause injuries, either fractures or separations of the thyroid cartilage, which is part of the larynx, or the hyoid bone. Those couldn't be assessed. But you don't typically, for strangulations, don't typically expect to see the cervical vertebrae injured, because they're sort of there deep in the center of the neck. They're covered by a lot of bone and other structures, and usually it takes something significant, like you see motor vehicle accident or an individual who falls and breaks their neck. That might be a reason why a neck's broken, but you don't typically see that in a strangulation, and I wouldn't expect to in most strangulations unless it were extremely forceful.
Okay, so doctor, is it possible that Karen Swift's death was caused by strangulation and the wound to the head was post-mortem?
It certainly is possible.
Okay. Then why is blunt force trauma listed as the cause of death if strangulation is possible?
Because of the circumstances of which we were told, and this individual is found in a wooded area with a severe injury to the head, and that degree of injury to the head basically could, unless there was due to a car accident or a fall from a significant height, most likely was due to an assault. And because of that, that is sort of the most probable case, given the scene in which this individual was found and the injury, to most likely attribute the cause of death to the blunt force head trauma.
So is the protocol and forensic pathology that absent the obvious injury or an obvious injury to the throat area, which would have been evident of strangulation, you go with the obvious injury, which is the head injury?
That's correct.
Okay. So, and you just touched on it. Let's talk about the possible cause of skull fractures. Without any outside information, I think you just started on them. It could be a fall from height could have caused that?
Yes.
Okay. You said it could have been a car crash?
Yes.
And then last you said it could have been an assault?
Correct.
And from your examination of the autopsy, is it possible to tell which of these three, if either of them had occurred?
Without knowing anything else other than looking at the autopsy findings and the skull fracture itself, that can't be ascertained with any degree of certainty.
Okay, and assume for a moment that it was an assault, if you would. Is there any way possible to determine the exact cause of or the exact manner of the assault?
No, there are numerous possibilities for how that fracture might have been sustained in an assault.
You'd agree with me? The ways are infinite, the ways that people hurt other people.
Potentially.
Thank you. Pass the witness.
Dr. Ross, just a few questions. You and your office examined and processed the body.
Yes.
The body was thoroughly examined for evidence.
Excuse me?
The body was thoroughly examined for evidence.
Yes.
Things were taken from the body, such as the underpants, the scalp hair, the fiber from the hands, the nail clippings from underneath both hands, and nail clippings for DNA and forensic testing.
Yes.
The DNA and forensic testing from these items were given to another agency. You don't test those, do you?
We don't perform that testing. We just give those materials to another agency.
They go to the TBI crime lab.
Well, we release it to the, in this case, it was released to the Dyer County Sheriff's Office. and subsequently it's the law enforcement agency that then makes the decision to transfer to, the materials to TBI for further testing.
Okay, thank you, sir. In your report, let me just ask you a few things. In your report, you indicate the black underpants were present during your processing and pulled down from the upper thighs.
Yes.
That was the only clothing that was included.
Yes.
All right. Those is why the testing was done of the panties.
Excuse me?
That's why the testing was done of the panties.
Well, I don't know if they were tested. I wasn't informed whether they were or weren't, but we did remove them to be submitted as evidentiary material.
Okay. In your report, there was a diagram prepared showing different things on the body.
Yes.
That was to show any wounds or marks.
Yeah, that is a, sketches are made by the pathologist performing the autopsy at the time, and usually they're used to help them when they make their dictation to show. It's meant to be a schematic and essentially a memory aid for the pathologist to note what was present on the body so that when they do their dictation, we rely typically more on the photographs to show the more actual things that occur, but the diagrams are a helpful aid.
According to the diagrams, were there any indication of scrapes, marks, or bruises indicating a possible struggle?
Well, no, but that couldn't be ruled out because of the degree of decomposition of the body.
Okay. But you can't tell just because of that whether or not there was a struggle to any degree of reasonable certainty.
Right. The autopsy does not demonstrate that one way or the other.
But on the diagram, there are marks on the diagram of
Yes.
the front and the back indicating things on the body. Is that correct?
Yes, basically areas of tissue loss on the body, and of course the areas of exposed bone, and of course the skull fracture on the head.
Okay. The cause of death, you explained, was blunt force injury of the head.
Correct.
Okay. Can you say with any degree of reasonable medical certainty, and isn't reasonable medical certainty the standard that you have to use?
Well, it's discussed as as what is most probable. So you look at what is most probable, and that is what you ascertain to be the likely cause.
Is that because you don't want to guess or speculate if you don't have enough evidence or information?
Correct.
Okay. And is that very important?
Yes, we do want to avoid over speculating.
Okay. Can you elaborate the type of instrument or mechanism that delivered the injury?
In this particular case, it could be any number of objects. It's hard. We really can't be precise as to what may have done it.
Could it be a hammer?
Could have been.
Could it be, would it be a hard object?
It would be a hard object.
So you could at least say it would be a hard object that delivered this mechanism of injury.
Yes.
All right. You talked about the open and closed wound,
Yes.
the difference between those. In this case, you cannot make a reasonable certainty as to which one it was.
No, I cannot.
You indicated with the open wound it would more likely show evidence of discharge of fluids and blood.
Yes.
Is it possible that a closed wound would, over time or a short period of time, show evidence of discharge of fluid or blood?
A closed wound, not necessarily, no.
But would it possibly occur at some point?
Oh, basically, at a point when there's decomposition and the skin starts to break down, you might get it, but otherwise I wouldn't necessarily expect it. Now, of course, depending upon, even though it's a closed wound, if the surface of it has some degree of abrasion, but it's not an actual open, but sort of like scraping, you might still get a little blood loss from that.
Okay. But in this case, you can't tell which one it was?
No.
All right. The prosecutor asked you about strangulation.
Yes.
You can't tell whether or not there was strangulation involved in this case.
No, I cannot.
And if you don't have enough information to make that call.
No.
So if you made that call with the information you have, you would just be guessing.
Yes.
Okay. Just one moment. You don't have enough information in this case to say whether or not a sexual assault or penetration occurred.
No, we can't determine that in this case.
Okay. Let's see. I guess the materials or the chemicals, the findings of whether alcohol, caffeine, and the other things that were found in the body was done through a toxicology report.
Yes.
That was something that was done outside of your agency.
Yes.
Okay. And let me just ask you this. Are you trained on the levels of, I guess, alcohol and these different substances as to their levels and what they mean?
Well, when they're present in non-decomposed tissue, yes, to some extent we can make an assessment as to their significance, but with decomposed tissue, and such as this case, really all you can say is those items are present. The levels are basically meaningless.
Okay. So you can't, with a reasonable degree of medical certainty, say what levels they are?
No.
Let me ask this. Can you say with a reasonable degree of medical certainty when they were either ingested or taken, what time frame before death?
Not necessarily. A lot would depend upon what the half-life of a drug is, so you would know how long it might have been in the body before it gets cleared out. And I honestly don't know off the top of my head what that would be for diphenhydramine. It's probably on the order of several hours. So it could have been, any time ingested within a 24-hour period before death, but I probably can't say much more than that.
So with that drug, it's possible it was ingested the day before death?
Yes.
All right. And the others, you can't say the time frame that they were ingested, whether it's hours before or the day before?
Right.
Thank you, Doctor.
Mr. Taylor gave you some specific examples of the mechanism of death. Doctors, the wounds that you see in the pictures there, are they consistent with a skull being, the left side of the skull being against a hard object such as a concrete floor, and the right side of the skull being have a very sharp force applied to it by, say, perhaps a heavy boot.
Yes.
Okay. Would you hand this to him? Doctor, I'm handing you a copy of a report. I just want you to identify it, make sure that it's a complete copy of the autopsy report.
Yes, this is a copy of our report of investigation, the autopsy report, also the odontology report where identification was made, and the toxicology report.
Would you make that an exhibit to your testimony, sir? No more questions.
Just one more thing.
Go ahead.
You stated a hard object could cause this sort of injury.
Yes.
Could you state how many pounds of pressure to the skull would be required or under the circumstances as you found the body?
To cause that degree of skull injury, I honestly don't have any recall of specific biomechanical data that might be required to cause that, so I don't know that I could comment on that at this time.
To any degree of medical certainty?
To any degree of medical certainty.
Thank you.
Okay, doctor, you can sit down. Thank you. The report was Exhibit 18